Many ordinary people are convinced that the 19th century was an era devoid of global upheavals, a time of balls, high society gatherings, and a leisurely pace of life. The skeptic's main argument sounds solid. If there had been any catastrophes, floods, or devastating wars of unknown nature back then, the great writers and poets certainly would have written about them. It seems impossible to hide events of such magnitude when the best minds of humanity were putting pen to paper. But the paradox is that they did write about them. Evidence of these events exists. It lies openly on the pages of the classic works we are used to reading in school. The problem is simply that we have forgotten how to read them literally, dismissing everything as artistic allegories and metaphors, when these may well have been documentary chronicles that leaked through the harsh censorship of that time. As our first witness, we call upon a man who can hardly be suspected of writing science fiction or dystopias, Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev. Let us turn to his famous novel, Home of the Gentry. One scene describes the 45-year-old protagonist, Lavretsky. He returns to his family estate, weary of life and failed romance. Sitting on a garden bench, he falls into deep thought, addressing the younger generation. At first glance, this is the usual nostalgia of an aging man, but look closely at the essence of his words. Lavretsky says, "You will not have to seek your path as we did, to struggle, to fall and rise amidst the darkness. We scrambled just to survive. And how many of us did not survive?" Usually, these lines are interpreted as a description of mental anguish or the search for a life path. But if we drop the habit of looking for hidden philosophical meaning and understand the text literally, the picture changes in a frightening way. Phrases like "rise amidst the darkness" and "scrambled just to survive" cease to be figures of speech. They begin to sound like a description of a real struggle for physical existence during a catastrophe. The words about how many people did not survive point to a mass loss of life, the causes of which remain outside the brackets of official history. To understand what period is being discussed, it is enough to compare the dates. The action of the novel takes place in 1842, and Lavretsky, according to the text, is 45 years old. This means he was born in 1797. His conscious youth, the age of 14 to 16, falls within the period of 1811 to 1813. It was then, in his teenage years, that this generation encountered something terrible that forced them to survive in the dark. Turgenev left us only a hint, the restrained memory of a survivor. However, to understand the details of exactly what was hidden behind this darkness, we will need the help of another author who described what was happening with frightening, almost photographic precision. If you read Turgenev's lines carefully, you can notice a strange dissonance between the peaceful picture of the noble estate and those eerie memories that wash over the main character. Lavretsky is not just grieving for his lost youth. He draws a clear line between two completely different worlds. The current world, where one can get things done and enjoy life, and the world of the past, where the main and only task was the physical preservation of life. The verb to survive, which the author uses, carries a very specific meaning. Usually, people speak this way about those who have gone through a shipwreck, a devastating earthquake, or a total catastrophe, but certainly not about members of the privileged gentry, whose lives, according to history textbooks, should have been relatively safe and well-fed. The key to the mystery lies in the chronology that Turgenev constructs with mathematical accuracy. The novel describes the events of 1842. Through simple calculations, we found out that the hero's youth, that very period of personality formation, fell on the interval from 1811 to 1813. It was in this time frame that Lavretsky, as a teenager, witnessed events that forced an entire generation to fall and rise amidst the darkness. And here the word darkness requires special attention. Literary scholars have convinced us for decades that this is a metaphor, the darkness of ignorance, political reaction, or spiritual turmoil. But what if the writer was brutally honest and described the surrounding reality literally? What if the darkness was a physical phenomenon, an absence of sunlight, a dense veil covering the earth? This hypothesis explains both the strange phrase that they had to seek their path in the dark, and the mention of the huge number of those who did not survive. We are not talking about the natural passing of generations, but about mass death caused by external, insurmountable circumstances. Turgenev, being a master of realistic prose, was forced to soften the edges and clothe the terrible truth in the form of melancholic reflections in order to pass censorship or not be branded a madman. He left us only an emotional imprint of the tragedy, a sense of the horror experienced, without going into naturalistic details. However, where the novelist was forced to speak in hints, the poet could allow himself much more frankness. To confirm the guess about the physical nature of this darkness, we need to turn to the work of Nikolai Alexeyevich Nekrasov. In his legacy, there is a piece that describes with frightening detail what Turgenev only hinted at. If Lavretsky speaks of consequences and survival, then Nekrasov, in his poem The Grief of Old Naum, transports us to the very epicenter of the cataclysm. His lines can no longer be written off as emotional distress. This is a chronicle of a climate collapse, documented in rhyme. What he describes resembles a doomsday scenario, and these descriptions correlate surprisingly well with modern concepts of the consequences of global catastrophes. Nikolai Nekrasov, in his poem The Grief of Old Naum, written in 1874, leaves us a testimony that, upon closer examination, ceases to seem like fiction and takes on the features of a frightening documentary. If Turgenev only cautiously hinted at a certain darkness, Nekrasov paints a picture of a planetary catastrophe with the directness of an eyewitness. Let us read the lines describing the state of the world in those years. The sun forgot to shine, the clear moon went out, and it was hard to distinguish the stormy day from the night. These words describe not just cloudy weather or a severe thunderstorm. The poet speaks of the total disappearance of celestial bodies. The sun and the moon are not just hidden by clouds. They forgot to shine and went out, which indicates an impenetrable veil that cut off the Earth's surface from solar light. The description that it became impossible to distinguish day from night is a classic sign of what modern science calls the nuclear winter effect, or, if you like, volcanic winter. This is a state of the atmosphere where a colossal amount of dust, ash, or soot rises into the stratosphere, forming a dense screen that blocks solar radiation. But Nekrasov does not limit himself to describing the darkness. He adds sonic and dynamic details that heighten the sense of a technological or natural apocalypse. Thunder rumbled incessantly, and the whirlwind was terrible, and man stood beneath it, frightened and voiceless. Here we see a mention of a ceaseless roar and a destructive vortex, which strongly resembles the description of the passage of a powerful shock wave and accompanying atmospheric disturbances. Man in this chaos turns out to be voiceless, crushed by the magnitude and horror of what is happening, realizing his complete helplessness in the face of the raging elements. Also present in the text is an important marker of time and the changing of eras. The lyrical hero mentions that before these events there was an easy time, but then everything changed in an instant. It describes how, after a long period of gloom, the dawn luxuriously lit the edge of the azure. But immediately, a new storm came to replace the old storm. This testifies that the catastrophe had a prolonged character with several phases, finally destroying the former way of life and the ideals of the past. We see a clear description of huge masses of matter entering the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Official historiography and climatology do not deny the fact of global cooling and the darkening of the skies in the early 19th century. There is even a scientific explanation for this phenomenon, related to natural cataclysms in Southeast Asia. It is generally accepted that the culprit of the darkness was the eruption of the Tambora volcano. However, when we begin to compare the scale of the described destruction with the official figures of volcanic explosion energy, serious questions arise. Is a single volcano, however powerful, capable of causing such long-lasting and global consequences? Or was it only part of a much grander and more terrible puzzle? To understand this, we need to turn to the language of dry numbers and physical quantities. Official science offers us a very specific explanation for the climate anomalies of the early 19th century, which went down in history as the year without a summer. According to the accepted version, the cause of the global cooling was the catastrophic eruption of the Mount Tambora volcano on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa in April 1815. This event is considered the largest volcanic eruption in documented human history. The release of ash and gas was so colossal that it indeed changed the composition of the atmosphere across the entire planet. However, to realize the true scale of what happened, it is necessary to translate dry geological data into the language of destructive power understandable to modern man. The energy released by the Tambora explosion is estimated by specialists at 800 megatons of TNT equivalent. For comparison, this is comparable to the simultaneous detonation of 800 nuclear warheads with a yield of 1 megaton each, or 400 even more powerful 2 megaton bombs. Up to 180 cubic kilometers of volcanic material were ejected into the atmosphere. Huge masses of sulfur oxide reached the stratosphere, where, reacting with water vapor, they turned into sulfuric acid. This suspension enveloped the Earth in a thick blanket reflecting the sun's rays. The result was the so-called volcanic winter. The average temperature on the planet dropped, causing frosts in the middle of July and disastrous crop failures. The consequences of this blow to the biosphere were horrifying. The sharp change in climate and atmospheric pollution triggered outbreaks of severe diseases. An epidemic of typhus broke out in Southeast Europe and the Mediterranean, and a completely new, previously unknown strain of cholera emerged in Bengal, beginning its deadly march across the world. It would seem the puzzle fits. The volcano exploded, ash covered the sun, famine and disease ensued. But an inquisitive mind cannot help but ask, is an eruption on a distant Indonesian archipelago really capable of explaining all those strange phenomena that eyewitnesses described in the central part of Russia? The mathematics of the catastrophe are impressive, but they do not answer the question about the nature of the event itself. Was the volcano the sole cause, or was its eruption merely a consequence, a chain reaction to the use of a weapon of incredible destructive power, or an impact from outside? After all, if the explosion energy is calculated in hundreds of megatons, the impact on the Earth's crust could have been critical. Moreover, descriptions of phenomena have been preserved in Russian literature that are difficult to attribute to the simple spread of volcanic ash. Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, in one of his works, describes something that, in its dynamics and acoustic effects, looks nothing like a natural phenomenon, but rather resembles the approach of a monstrous shockwave. Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, usually considered the greatest satirist of his time, left a description in his novel The History of a Town that upon close examination evokes not laughter, but a cold shiver. The concept of this work arose in the 1850s, and although it is generally considered a grotesque allegory of Russian reality, fragments of the text read like a dry documentary report on a technological or natural catastrophe of monstrous force. In one key scene, the inhabitants of the town of Glupov are struck by an unheard-of spectacle. The author writes that the northern horizon darkened and was covered with clouds, from which something rushed rapidly toward the city. It is important to pay attention to the physics of this phenomenon, described by the writer with frightening authenticity. It looked neither like ordinary rain nor a tornado in the usual sense. An unknown force moved, literally boring into the earth, rumbling, humming, and emitting unnatural, hollow croaking sounds. Such behavior is characteristic of heavy gas dust clouds or shock waves moving along the ground and grinding up the soil. But even more telling is what happened before direct contact with this force. Saltykov-Shchedrin points out a crucial detail. Although it was not yet close, the air in the city began to vibrate. The described effect is a classic sign of the arrival of a powerful shockwave or a pressure impact, preceding the visual front of a catastrophe. The text states that the bells in the towers began to ring by themselves and the trees bristled. Such resonance occurs with extreme infrasound exposure or a seismic jolt. Animals, possessing a finer sensitivity to pressure changes and vibrations, went mad and panicked in the fields, finding no escape. The final scene paints a picture of the total collapse of the familiar world. The earth shook, the sun dimmed, and the people were seized by an indescribable, primal horror. The phrase, "it came," sounds like a sentence. Behind these words hides not political satire, but a chronicle of a nightmare experienced when the sky turns black in the middle of the day, and the solid ground gives way beneath one's feet. Of course, one could argue that writers are creative people, prone to dramatization and hyperbole. Skeptics might declare that all these images are merely the fruit of the vivid imagination of literati striving to create an atmosphere of anxiety. However, if literary metaphors find direct confirmation in dry, emotionless historical summaries and reports, it becomes impossible to ignore them. The strange phenomena of those years were recorded not only in artistic novels, but also in documents not intended for the general public. Facts exist indicating that in the very center of Russia, on the absolutely calm Russian plain, the earth did indeed shudder, and bells rang by themselves, confirming that what the classics described was not fiction, but reality. In our search for the truth, we often neglect dry historical records, assuming that all the truth is hidden in emotional prose. However, it is the dispassionate reports of local historians and chroniclers of the 19th century that contain facts impossible to explain from the perspective of classical geology and history. The central Russian plain is an ancient, stable tectonic platform. Here, in the heart of Russia, earthquakes are an anomaly, an event entirely out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, documents testify to the contrary, confirming that the ground was slipping from under feet not metaphorically, but in the most literal sense. Let us turn to the work of Ivan Fyodorovich Efremov, Historical Review of the Tula Province, published in 1850. The author, scrupulously recording events of the past, describes strange underground shocks. He mentions that perceptible earthquakes occurred from underground forces of fire. One of them is dated October 14, 1802, when the tremors were so strong that buildings swayed everywhere, and dishes fell off tables. An even more frightening picture was observed in Kaluga, Litvin, and Kozelsk, where church bells began to ring by themselves, without the participation of bell ringers. Later, on January 11, 1838, a similar phenomenon recurred. The trembling of the earth lasted about a minute. Efremov notes an important detail. Both times the vibrations propagated in a direction from south to north. What could cause such seismic activity in a seismically quiet zone? Usually, such effects occur during powerful explosions or the impact of large celestial bodies, the shock wave from which causes the Earth to shudder for hundreds of kilometers around. These seismic anomalies are complemented by testimonies of atmospheric and fiery phenomena preceding them. Mikhail Zagoskin, in his novel Roslavlev, or The Russians in 1812, conveys the anxious atmosphere of that time, comparing it to the oppressive feeling before a severe thunderstorm. His characters speak of a premonition of distant misfortune. But the most interesting part lies in the details that many skip. The characters recall that it was not for nothing that last year an unseen star moved in the heavens for so long. This mention of a comet or bolide is accompanied by a grim description of the consequences. Not for nothing did cities, villages, and forests burn, and in many places the earth burned out. Pay attention to the phrasing. Not just forest fires, but places where the earth burned out. This description suggests the impact of extremely high temperatures capable of destroying the fertile soil layer, turning it into a lifeless wasteland. Zagoskin writes that this happened before the start of the official war, before the invasion of enemy armies. That is, the Great War he speaks of further on could have been merely a consequence or continuation of a global cataclysm that began with a celestial flash and the trembling of the Earth's crust. Burning cities and scorched territories became the scenery in which subsequent historical events unfolded. If the testimonies of Afromov and Zagoskin paint a picture of physical destruction, a logical question arises. Did the main poet of the era, the son of Russian poetry, stay on the sidelines? Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin lived at this time, breathed this air, and saw these landscapes. Could he have remained silent? Of course not. However, his legacy that has reached us may have undergone thorough editing, hiding the true meaning of his lines. Pushkin knew much more than is generally believed, and he left us encrypted messages, the keys to which we are only just beginning to find. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, whose name for many is synonymous with Russian literature, was perhaps not just a poet, but a keeper of knowledge that could not be transmitted in plain text. If we discard the usual school interpretations and look at his fairy tales and poems as encrypted messages, a completely different, technogenic picture of the past opens up. Recall the famous introduction to the poem Ruslan and Ludmila. Everyone knows the image from childhood. A green oak by the curved seashore, a golden chain upon that oak. We are used to seeing this as a fairy tale forest, but let's try to apply technical terminology. What is a green oak? In nature, oaks have brown bark and green foliage, but if we are talking about a structure, then green is a characteristic sign of oxidized copper. A copper pillar or tower covered with the patina of time. On this pillar is a golden chain. Gold is one of the best conductors of electricity. It results in a description of a technical device, an oxidized copper core wrapped in conductive gold wire or chain. The learned cat walking on the chain could be an allegory for some mechanism or carriage moving along a closed loop. As for Lucamore itself, it is a specific geographical point on ancient maps where endless swamps and wastelands now stretch, as if a catastrophe occurred on the site of a once developed center, wiping everything from the face of the earth. This hypothesis of global destruction finds confirmation in other, more realistic texts by the poet. In 1820, Pushkin wrote a poem with a telling title, I Saw Asia's Barren Limits. In it, there are lines that are difficult to interpret ambiguously. The distant edge of the Caucasus, the scorched valleys. Why are the valleys of Asia and the Caucasus called scorched? This does not look like a metaphor for summer heat. The word scorched implies the impact of open fire or colossal temperatures that turned blooming lands into ashes. The poet records a landscape scorched by an unknown force, leaving us documentary evidence of the scale of the disaster, which went far beyond the borders of one country. However, far from all of Pushkin's words have reached us in their original form. His works were subjected to harsh censorship and posthumous editing, sometimes changing the meaning beyond recognition. A striking example is the poem The Bronze Horseman. The famous line, "He reared Russia up on its hind legs," might have been absent or sounded different in the original drafts. In rare editions from the mid-19th century, for example in a book from 1857, one can find notes made in ink stating that a significant part of the text was composed or rewritten by Vasily Zhukovsky, the poet's mentor and friend, who also acted as a censor. It turns out that the textbook lines we learn by heart are the result of a safe edit designed to hide the true meaning of what was written. If Zhukovsky rewrote entire quatrains, what exactly was he trying to hide? Perhaps the original text contained descriptions of the causes of the flood in St. Petersburg, or the state of the country after the catastrophe that were too frank and did not fit into the official version of history. We see only the tip of the iceberg pass through the filter of state secrets. And if even landscapes and natural phenomena were encrypted, then what about the political figures of that time? It is quite likely that even the name of the main enemy of the Russian Empire in the War of 1812, Napoleon, is not just a proper name, but another layer of a complex linguistic puzzle pointing to the true culprit of the disasters. In light of the emerging facts and strange climate anomalies, even the familiar history of the Patriotic War of 1812 begins to take on completely new colors if viewed through the prism of linguistic analysis and climatic catastrophe. The central figure of those events was Napoleon Bonaparte. The name of the French emperor is familiar to everyone, but few have thought about its sacred or perhaps encrypted meaning. In mythology, Apollo is the god of light, the patron of the arts, the personification of the sun. If we break down the name Napoleon, or in the older transcription, Ni-Poleo, into its components, we can see a curious construction. The prefix ne, negation, and the root referring to Apollo. The result is ne-Apollo, that is, not sun, or absence of sun. This etymological play may not have been accidental. In an era when symbolism played a huge role, Napoleon's invasion could have been an allegorical description of the onset of darkness, that very period when the sun forgot to shine. Thus, the War of 1812 in literary monuments and hidden chronicles may describe not so much a military conflict between two powers, but humanity's struggle against the advancing cold and gloom. Nay, Apollo came to the lands, and with him the light vanished. This explains the famous frosts that destroyed the Grand Army. Perhaps the cold was not just a tactical ally of the defenders, but the very essence of the unfolding cataclysm. In this context, Pushkin's words describing the enemy army sound different. In his texts, he mentions that Moscow suffered from all sorts of rabble. This is an extremely unusual characterization for a regular army known for its discipline and beautiful uniforms with white trousers. The word rabble paints an image of a motley crowd, vagabonds lacking unified command. If we accept the version of a global climatic catastrophe that caused famine and devastation in Europe, then the so-called invasion turns into a desperate migration. It was the movement of huge masses of hungry, freezing people fleeing the devastated territories of the West in search of food and surviving lands in the East. They went not to conquer, but to survive. The burning cities contemporaries wrote about could have been not the result of a scorched earth tactic, but a consequence of those very fiery phenomena and falling celestial bodies that preceded the migration. Europeans, faced with years without a summer, crop failures, and cold, moved to where, it seemed to them, life was still preserved. History remembers this as a great war. But perhaps it was the agony of a civilization trying to save itself from a climate collapse. The puzzle begins to come together into a single picture, where war, cold, and darkness are links in the same chain. And most importantly, this tragedy was not a local Russian problem. evidence of global gloom was left not only by domestic authors. If we look at the works of their foreign contemporaries, it becomes clear. Darkness covered not one country, but the entire known world then. George Byron, Evdokia Rostovchina, Konstantin Balmont, all of them, located in different points of space and time, wrote about the same thing, as if conspiring to convey to their descendants the truth about the horror they experienced. If we assemble all the found fragments into a single canvas, a picture emerges that is frightening in its realism. George Byron in his poem Darkness, Evdokia Rostovchina describing the views of ruined Moscow. Konstantin Balmont with his legends of deaf days. All these voices merge in unison with Turgenev, Nekrasov, and Pushkin. We see not the scattered fantasies of literati prone to melancholy, but consistent witness testimonies of a global planetary catastrophe. The conclusion suggests itself. In the early 19th century, humanity survived an event that, in its physical characteristics and consequences, is identical to what we call nuclear winter today. Dust veils blocking the sun, sharp cooling, acid rain, shock waves that made the earth shudder, and mass migrations of survivors. These are not allegories. This is a chronicle of the survival of a civilization that found itself on the brink of total destruction. Official historical science recognizes only a small part of this tragedy, shamefully calling it the year without a summer, and attributing everything to a distant Indonesian volcano. We are told about epidemics and crop failures, but the causes of scorched valleys, destroyed cities, and that very Great War, which looked more like the chaotic movement of peoples across a cooling earth, are carefully passed over in silence. The most striking thing about this investigation is not the fact of the catastrophe itself, but the total oblivion to which it was consigned. An event that redrew the map of the world and claimed millions of lives has been wiped clean from school textbooks and academic lectures. Only encrypted lines in poems, memoirs corrected by censors, and strange architectural ruins remain of it. The feeling arises that the history of the 19th century was intentionally rewritten, creating an illusion of continuous and prosperous development, while in reality, it was a time of rising from the ashes. Here we come to the main and most uncomfortable question. Why was it decided to classify these events? If it was a natural disaster, why hide its scale? And if the cause was technological, then who struck this blow? Who benefited from hiding the truth about the past, forcing us to believe in balls and the crunch of French bread, and to forget how our ancestors survived in the darkness? The answers to these questions could overturn our entire understanding of the world order and of those forces that actually controlled and continue to control the historical process. This secret is so massive that it requires a separate, even deeper investigation. To not miss the solution and to find out who rewrote human history and why, stay with us. The truth is somewhere nearby, and we will definitely dig it up.